So, not last week, typo, but this week we're looking at the Davidic covenant. We're looking at the context of this covenant, the blessings of this covenant, the conditions of this covenant, and the sanctions of this covenant as well. After we finish studying the Davidic covenant, we're going to, on chapter 9 of Sam Renihan's book, sort of circle back. And we're going to try to understand the presentation of the Old Testament regarding the Messiah. You know how I said we're trying to be patient and we're gonna wait until we're done with these Old Testament historical covenants before we sort of go back and say, this points to Christ, this points to Christ, this points to Christ. We're going to get there next week. So, what is going on? Yes?
Can I just ask a very quick question?
Yes.
Why is the Davidic covenant titled like a different JPEG picture?
Oh, I just found it. So, the other ones didn't have a nice one like that. I just found it on Google Images. What a great question, yes. So, what is going on in the Davidic covenant? Well, Sam writes, the kingdom of Israel was established and ruled by covenants. The land was promised to Abraham's people in the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic covenant instituted the full complex of laws that God used to rule the people in the land. In the Davidic covenant, the kingdom reaches a sort of consummation, if you will. I mean, just think about David's heyday, right? That was like, wow, these are the promises being fulfilled in our very midst. As it was for the Mosaic covenant, so also in this case, awareness of the context of the covenant is indeed vital. So let's understand the context. We've just read that lengthy passage of the Lord's covenant with David, what promises, the issue of royalty, the fact that even as David goes to the grave, God will raise up an offspring after him. I mean, the connections are already so clear. You just can't miss it. I was pointing to the offspring once again, who is Christ, His resurrection from the dead, His being enthroned, His being given the scepter of righteousness. It's all there. So, what is the context of this covenant? Well, first of all, the context of this covenant brings us once again back to the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. When God told Abraham in Genesis 17, specifically, this is one of the things that He said, that I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come out of you. That's Genesis 17, verse 6. So God promised Abraham, and He promised Sarah, and He later on even told Isaac that kings would come from their line. That was an expansion of the Abrahamic promises. You can't miss that. You can't disconnect Genesis 12 from 15 and from 17. This is one expanded covenant promise regarding now kings. And this promise eventually begins to narrow down to one tribe among Israel, and that is the tribe of the kings. That's the priests. Judah. You're close. The two come together in Christ, right? Priests and kings. The tribe of Judah. Very good. And the Davidic covenant is therefore a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that indeed kings would come from him. God's not going to fail in His promises. If He says kings are going to come from the line of Abraham, it's going to happen. And here we're seeing it happen. And from here, the Davidic covenant, the kingdom of Israel further develops. So it brings us back to the promises of the Abrahamic covenant, and not only that, it brings us back to the problems of the Mosaic covenant. Now, not that the covenant itself had a problem, but it presented problems for sinful Israel. You see, the Mosaic covenant governed all of Israel in the land. It gave the law of the land. It was very clear. And when they took the promised land, conquest was hard. It didn't all happen overnight, but the truth is, it did happen. They really did receive their inheritance. Now, there's a sense wherein the conquest was an official receiving of the inheritance. The book of Joshua says that. But there's also in a sense that it progressed. It continued. You know, just because you finally received the plot of land that was promised to you, officially speaking, and it's on paper and all of that, doesn't necessarily mean that there's not some squatters still hanging around, right? So throughout time, they would still need to continue the expansion of taking every part of the promised land. Nevertheless, we studied this back in chapter 6 when we talked about the Abrahamic covenant. Joshua made it very clear. The Lord gave to Israel all the land that He swore to give to their fathers. We've got to take that at face value. It wasn't as clean as you might have expected, but God did it. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as He had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. Get that? All came to pass. So, like I said, God never said that there wouldn't be squatters. There would be a back and forth at times between Israel and the other settlers. Later on they even get exiled, right? So all that happens. But the point is they received their inheritance. In saying that, don't forget that people under this covenant could get disinherited for their disobedience, right? I'm giving the people the land. There we go. That's great. But don't forget, from the covenant of circumcision and later to the blessings and curses of the Mosaic covenant, it is very clear you continue in disobedience, I'm going to disinherit you. And that's the problem that the Mosaic covenant clearly poses. The Mosaic covenant's terms themselves, the laws that God gave there, are righteous, they're good, they're morally binding because they come from God, but the people are the problem. The people are not necessarily changed or transformed. The people are still unfaithful. And once we get to the book of Judges, that's very, very clear. It's in your face that there is a problem with the people. Here's what we see in Judges. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation, a new generation after the previous one died, after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that He had done for Israel. We're always only just one generation away from forgetting the blessings of God upon our people. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And He said, because this people have transgressed my covenant. Take note of that language. God's about to curse them. God's about to do something because they have transgressed the covenant that I have commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice. Here's the disinheriting language. I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. Right? So there were still nations to be delivered into their hands. There were, absolutely. And God is now saying, I'm no longer going to drive them out. That's language of disinheritance. It's the opposite of the inheritance. The inheritance was, I'm going to drive you out, you're going to take all the land. The language of disinheritance is, because of your disobedience, I'm not going to drive them out. You're not going to take over the land. They're going to start taking over yours. They're going to start moving back in. And before the conquest, Moses made those blessings and curses very, very clear. An entire generation had died in the wilderness. That is a huge warning. But in Judges, here we are. A generation that has forgotten their heritage. So, God punished Israel for transgressing the covenant. The punishment was already embedded in circumcision, which was given to Abraham. If you don't follow, you will be cut off. And then it was expanded with a myriad of blessings and curses under Moses, which really culminated back at the heart of it, which is you'll be cut off. You'll be disinherited. And you probably are familiar with these famous words from Judges 21. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You got to get that context, because that is the context of the Davidic covenant. Everyone was sinning, and they had no king, they had no leadership, they were oppressed, they needed help, they needed a representative who would uphold the law for the nation. In other words, they really needed a king. That's what they needed. That's the context. Thirdly, there's also the preference of the people. with that context in mind, that there was a problem in the land, there was no king, they had nobody to guide them and to lead them, at least as an earthly representative, well, we now get to the solution that the people have. The solution that the people have doesn't necessarily sound like a bad one. We need a king, right? I mean, I just said, it's clear that they did need a king. But this was a solution that was based on their own preference. Because we shouldn't overlook the fact that we call it the Davidic covenant, right? But David was not the first king of Israel. Who was the first king of Israel, technically? It was Saul. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people were threatened by the Ammonites. And their response to that was, okay, we want a king. We want a king to fight for us. So what did they do? They went to the man Samuel, who was a prophet. He called upon him to appoint a king for the people. But what did Samuel say? Like, I don't have a directive from God on this. This is just something you guys came up with. I don't want to do it. And you know what God's response was to Samuel? Because the people were hardened and their motives were actually wrong. God decided, you know what? Samuel, go ahead. Give them what they want so that they can see what happens. The Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done. From the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So also they are doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. What you've read just right there is a lot like what we see in places like Romans chapter 1. It's not a perfect parallel, but one of the most drastic signs of judgment upon a people is when they are trying to follow their sinful hearts, they're asking for the wrong things, and you know what God says? He lets go, and He finally just goes, all right, get it. Get what you want. I'm gonna let you have what you want. I'm gonna let you have your desires. I'm gonna let you make your own choices. And people go on happy, and they feel like, what do you mean judgment of God? There is no judgment of God. We're getting what we want. And the Bible actually shows a lot of times that is the judgment of God. It's when you are getting what your sinful heart wants. So their pursuit of a king was rooted in their lack of trust in God. Now, if you look at this passage, you'll see, if you look at 1 Samuel 8, Samuel warns them in verses 10 to 18 that if they choose their own king, that king essentially, for lack of a better way of saying it, would suck. All right, that's it. He would be a horrible king. It's not going to be good. He's going to be selfish. He's going to be proud. He's going to be a warmonger. He's going to lord it over the people. He's going to take from you, and you're not going to get anything from him. And then in verses 19 to 22, they insist, no, there shall be a king over us. And here's the heart of the motive, that we may also be like all the nations. It was an issue of war. It was an issue of power. Remember those times when God says, do not trust in chariots. Zechariah, not by might nor by strength, but by my spirit, says the Lord. So we are uncovering a heart issue here. They want to be like the other nations. They lack trust in their God, who promises to deliver them even when they don't have the military power. And He's saying, we want to be powerful like the other nations. And God says to them, all right, obey their voice, make them a king. And the point is, the people actually didn't want the kingdom which God establishes. The people here wanted a kingdom like the ones man has established, like the nations around them. It was a rejection of God as king. It was a rejection of God's rules. And of course, Israel's first choice was a flop. Everyone knows how the story goes. They chose Saul, who was explicitly not a man after God's own heart, and not only that, was not from the tribe of Judah. So what was the result? It was a huge failure. And man-made empires, just like Saul's, and what they were trying to cultivate, will always fall. What happened was exactly what Samuel warned. He wasn't a great king. He was proud. He would lord it over. He did not lead the people in righteousness. But of course, in God's providence, Saul was killed, essentially dethroned. And now this brings us from Abraham's promises to Moses' precepts, to Israel's conquest, to the judge's deliverance, to the people's preference, and finally to Saul's failures. And now we've got that context where David comes in. But there's one more thing we need to know. That is the prospect of consummation. What do we mean? The Mosaic covenant anticipated the Davidic covenant by laying out basic laws for the king. And by giving basic laws for the king, there was attached to those basic laws a prospect of consummation. In other words, when this king comes and he keeps these rules, he keeps a book of the law with him, he allows it to govern the land and so on, the kingdom, in a sense, of Israel would be consummated. It would reach that point, like it'll really be teeming with life, flowing with milk and honey. The enemies will not scare you. You're going to have a glorious kingdom on earth. The Mosaic covenant looked forward to a time when there would be a centralized location for sacrificial worship in the kingdom. Remember, before the kingdom was firmly established, they were still kind of like nomads. Before they went into the conquest, they were still going around the wilderness. Even when they had a tabernacle, the tabernacle would move. And the prospect that is given in the Mosaic covenant anticipating the Davidic is that there's going to be centralized worship, God's presence will be in the land, and it's going to be yours. It will be the consummated form of the kingdom of Israel. This is a lengthy passage, but I think it's good that we read it in full. This is what we read all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 12. You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Remember the context of Deuteronomy? This is before entering the land. He's telling them what their life should be once they get there. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when He gives you rest from all your enemies around so that you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make His name dwell there, here's what you got to do when you get there. You shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants, and the Levite that is within your towns, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. The Davidic covenant, therefore, is the consummation of these words, of these expectations. They enter the land. Here they weren't in rest yet, but when they enter the land, they're able to get rest. They get rest from their enemies. And then God makes His name dwell locally, aka the temple. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not even David ultimately who builds a temple, right? Who really finishes the building of the temple? Who really does the work? It's his son, Solomon. But that's the consummation. I mean, that's climax right there. The people of God dwell in the land of God with the presence of God and the blessings of God. And how glorious were the days of blessing in God's in David's time, in Solomon's time, when the temple was there, when the enemies were defeated, when Israel was so glorious. That was a picture of consummation. This is what the land of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was meant to be. But of course, we know that it never really lasted long. It wasn't perfect. It seemed like there had to be something better, there had to be something more. And one of the main problems, of course, was that the very kings of the nation, who were supposed to lead the nation in righteousness, were the very ones who were falling into sin time and time again. So that's the context of the Davidic covenant. That brings us now to the blessings of the covenant. What were the blessings found in this covenant? Well, Again, we go back to our key text. I hope, have your Bibles open to our key text, which is 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verses 8 to 16. And firstly, the blessing of the covenant, what we find in that passage is firstly an established throne. So take a look at verse 16. Your house in your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. David's house, David's kingdom will be established and will be made sure. Israel's true kingship is based here. It's based on God's commitment to establish David's throne. It's not based on the people's choice. It's not based on Saul. It's not based on that mess. It's based on a promise God made to establish David's throne. What is David's established throne? Well, when the king was reigning and ruling righteously as God's vice-regent, as God's representative on earth, the nation could look to God's anointed one for stability, for guidance, for hope, for answers to their questions. The enemies are coming. King, what shall we do? He was to have an established throne. Secondly, he was to have, the people were to have rest and prosperity and Canaan. Delicious, right? Milk and honey. I love milk and honey. You probably do too. Look at what we read in verses 10 and 11. I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. So there's the promise in the Davidic covenant. The people are going to have rest. The people are going to feel secure. And these were actually promised through Moses. These were actually partially fulfilled under Joshua. I mean, they were a powerhouse. But when Joshua and them entered the land, you look at it and look what's going on. It's definitely not consummate. It's not the peak. It's not the climax of the fulfillment. It's still problematic. It's still partial, and it is still very much incomplete. But under David, the rest and security was supposed to extend to the whole nation and not just certain tribes. Remember when the conquest happened? Some tribes got their inheritance, some didn't yet. And there were still a lot of these issues that needed to be worked out. But the idea was under the king, the anointed one of God, all the people would experience rest. And when Solomon dedicated the temple, well, Solomon said, "Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel." There it is. There's the consummation. According to all that he promised, not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke by Moses, his servant. Before that, his father David said, "Blessed be the Lord, my rock," and this is in Psalm 144, "who trains my hand for war and fingers for battle. He is my steadfast love and my fortress, my stronghold and my deliverer, my shield and he in whom I take refuge, who subdues peoples under me." You've got to understand what a mighty warrior David really was because of the promises of God. And this is what Israel needed. They needed it desperately, especially after the book of Judges, especially after their whole Saul experience. They needed rest. But they were also in need of the presence and protection of God. This is all bundled together, of course. Sam writes, through the Davidic covenant, God gave Israel an established throne, rest and prosperity in Canaan, and His own presence and protection. But this is only the I will part of the covenant. The you will part of the covenant, shortly, you will see, follows. So, in summary, the Davidic covenant uses the full language of God's presence. Back to our passage, look at verse 9. I have been with you wherever you went and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name. So this is God saying, I have been with David. And then later on in verse 13 it says, He, a son of David, later on, shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. One of David's descendants will build a house for God. And this will be a house with God's name, in other words, filled with God's presence. Verse 15, but my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. This coming king will have God's steadfast love upon him, and it's not going to depart from the descendant of David. And at the heart of the Davidic covenant is the temple. It's not just a tabernacle now. It's an actual temple. And David wouldn't end up building this temple because, again, God actually called him to be a warrior. He was the warrior that Israel needed at that time to defeat the enemies. God said that a man of peace would build it. Now, there's a lot of typology and stuff going on now. But David's son Solomon, his name means man of peace. And indeed, he did build it. And it looked forward to the greater man of peace who would build God's temple, as Zechariah says. So here's Solomon, and God promised Solomon that if he walked in God's ways, he, God, would dwell among the children of Israel. These are glorious promises. This is a lot of the I will of God. Remember from this morning's sermon, God has all of these I wills. But in this covenant, there is also the you will portions of the covenant. There are conditions. What are the conditions of the covenant? Well, the Davidic covenant was not just God's promises to David, but also God's commands and expectations to the Davidic line. There were sanctions. All covenants historically have sanctions, and faithfulness is required of this covenant. So firstly, this is the condition. Guard God's sanctuary. This is one of the tasks of the king. He needed to guard God's sanctuary. Back to our passage in verse 13. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. David's son shall build a house for God's name. And God's name represents himself. It represents his authority, his reputation, his presence. So here's the king's responsibility. You've got to construct a temple where God's glory will be manifested among the people through the temple worship and all of its ordinances, and you can't mess with that temple. You can't mess with the worship. You know why it was such a big deal to mess with temple worship and to perform it in a way which God has not ordained? You go, because God has commanded it? Yes, that's true. But also because the ordinances of temple worship are types and shadows of the Lord Jesus Christ. They preach the gospel. And to mess with the ordinances of the temple is much like preaching another gospel. That's why it's an issue. God cares about His people. God cares about the truth that is being represented to the people. So remember in Galatians when Paul said, if anybody, even an angel, comes to you preaching another gospel, may he be anathema? To mess with the temple institutions is to misrepresent truths about Jesus, His perfect sacrifice, His kingship, His mediating office as priest, and so on. It is essentially to change aspects of the gospel, to preach another gospel. Whoever does that is anathema. No wonder why God struck people down when they messed with temple worship. It is actually out of love for the people. He wants them to get the right truth, to get the right ordinances which communicate the right things about the Messiah. So the temple was completed by Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 8. There was a dedication service. There was a celebration. And Solomon led prayer. He said, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Because that's what the temple is saying. God would dwell with us. Behold, heaven in the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this servant, and to his plea, O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day towards this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall dwell there. that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers towards this place. The temple didn't really contain God. I think you know that. But it mediated God's presence to the people. This is central to the kingship, to the Davidic covenant, and that is God's presence. The king who would rule and who would build and protect the temple, preserve God's worship of God's people, and so on. That was a representation or a sign that God's presence was with the people. And as for the king, he must keep the worship of God pure. Protect the temple. Protect the sanctuary. Don't let people steal the Ark of the Covenant. Things like that. And this is important because this actually goes back to the Garden of Eden. It echoes the charge that God gave to Adam to protect the sanctuary of Eden, to protect pure worship, not to let deceivers like the serpent enter into God's sanctuary and distort the relationship between God and man. So here we're carrying these ideas even from Eden. Yes?
I'll ask questions or not?
Oh, let me think. Yeah, you can. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Sure.
Does that mean, because that was when Nathan is giving David, speaking to David, because God says, Nathan, tell him this. Is that what you also sort of eating from Adam and present even now, where it says, I will be his father, he will be my son, but if he commits iniquity,
Yes.
right there,
Yes.
the attitude messes up the action and gives almost another gospel and all these other things you're talking about.
Very good, yes. And it's similar in the sense that there are probationary terms. God says, I will establish the house of David. There's going to be a descendant from you. And he solidifies the Davidic line. Whoever the Messiah, the anointed, that's what anointed one means. Like, essentially, it's Messiah. It's going to come from David's line. Nevertheless, Mr. King, whoever you are to be my son. And many kings, because of their disobedience, were dethroned. They were removed from the blessed presence. They were removed from the sanctuary, if you will. And it does have that Edenic or Adamic charge and feel. You're supposed to be my son. And the whole my son carries over. David, the king, is God's son. Israel as a whole is God's son. The first Adam is known as God's son. All of them fail and look forward to a greater son of God, king, representative, who would truly protect the worship of God. Indeed, one who would even teach us to worship in spirit and in truth. Yes?
And from that then, it says, though, even that happens from the blows of the sons of men. If you get this massive, awesome words, but my mercy shall not depart from me.
Yeah.
Even though my mercy depart from me. So,
Yeah.
what is that?
What it means is he will not abandon the Davidic line. It doesn't mean that individual kings could not be dethroned in the Davidic line. They could be. But he will always restore the line. And there would always be one until Messiah comes. And he would come straight from that line. So, for example, there were some times, because of gross immoral misconduct, that the Davidic line was actually cursed. But the nature of the curses gave a certain set of generations before the curse would be lifted. And I don't have the time to do all the math right now, but that curse was lifted just in time for the Davidic king to come, the Lord Jesus Christ, to be born. Right? So it didn't mean that there wouldn't be curses that could be incurred by individual kings. It didn't mean that individual kings could not be dethroned and that God could even curse the line at times. But it did mean that God is going to stay true to his promises. No matter what, there will be an offspring of David who he shall raise up and have an everlasting kingship.
Because it's interesting, because Manasseh really made a mess.
He did.
And he repented fixed it up as much as he could. Josiah did really well.
Yeah.
Yet down the track, they still were suffering from the sins of Manasseh.
Exactly.
Kind of like a consequential.
Yeah.
And get this thing we
Yeah. And essentially the only hope, because it's such a recurring fact, the only hope is that this king who God is going to raise up, who is an offspring of David, it's almost as if it's forcing us to take a second and think, what kind of king has this guy got to be if he's really going to solve this problem? Yeah. And essentially you end up saying, well, I know this sounds unbelievable, but it sounds like he's got to be a sinless king. Because the whole problem of the kingly line has been they do well, but then they sin and they mess everything up. So if there's going to be an everlasting king with a throne and a scepter of righteousness that will lead the people into ways everlasting, you're almost thinking, it sounds like the only way is for him to be sinless. And that's exactly true.
It looks like the Hebrews saying, since, if, and when he does commit
Yeah.
iniquity, it's going to happen.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen.
Right with your phrase.
Yes.
You're gonna have one who's no iniquity.
Absolutely. Very good. Thanks for that. Yes, that's very clear. And so God's issues, as we've been saying, with kings moving forward always had to do with whether they purified the land from idolatry and immorality, and whether or not they led the people in holy worship of Him alone. That was the problem. When they fell to those sins, when kings had that problem, it really distorted the worship of God. It distorted the purity of God's people. And so God is telling the kings, don't just build the temple, but guard the temple. And although the king was not a priest per se, he shared purity concerns with the priesthood. He needed to work hand in hand with the priesthood because they together needed to be concerned with the purity of God's worship. So what else are the conditions? Guard God's sanctuary, and also, very, very straightforward and simple, keep God's laws. Whether it be the moral law embedded in the tablets, in our hearts, and the positive laws that gave Israel that had to do with their civil duties in the land, and the ceremonial laws that had to do with worship, the kings were required to actually write, listen to this, they were supposed to write a Levite-approved copy of the law, keep it, and submit themselves to God's commands. It was essentially the Constitution of Israel. I mean, what kind of governor, what kind of premier, what kind of president, what kind of monarch doesn't know the Constitution that their land is under? They must. They must. The king of Israel must. And so he takes the law and he keeps it with him, and he's supposed to submit to God's commands and rule the land according to those commands. So the kingship now, look at this, not only has priestly concerns, it also sort of has prophetic function. Because the prophets bring the word of God to the people. Offices are sort of coming together, still distinct. But things are happening here to advance the plan of redemption forward. Because think about it. They keep a copy of the law of God, and they lead Israel in keeping it. And the people are supposed to be able to come to the king and go, what must we do? And the king is supposed to give a righteous judgment, a prophetic voice. God's laws, not man's laws. Or else, what happens? Disinheritance, curse, abandonment. The king is supposed to be God's vice regent, once again echoing Eden. He is taking upon himself a new sort of Adamic charge. Now the sanctuary is not the sinless Eden. It is a sin-ridden Israel. Nevertheless, it needs to be governed by God's law. It's different, but it needs to be governed still by God's word. And when the king fails, God will discipline him with the rod of men. That's what the passage, our key passage says. When the king keeps the law, he and the people will be blessed. So guard the sanctuary, keep God's laws, and thirdly, represent God's people. There is a sense of federal headship here. First of all, only David's sons have a rightful claim to the kingship. You can't be a king if you're not part of David's line. But federal headship in the Davidic covenant goes even further than that. Sam writes, rather, listen to this, the Davidic king is appointed as the federal head of the Mosaic covenant. Because the Mosaic covenant had a mediator, Moses, but not a federal head. God delivered the law through Moses, but just because you were a descendant from Moses, or you were related to Moses, it didn't affect your standing in the Mosaic covenant, right? That's why we don't use the strong theological language of federal headship with Moses. Moses' disobedience in striking the rock, as opposed to speaking to it as commanded, may have disinherited him from his entrance into Canaan, but nobody else suffered for his infraction. Do you see the idea of headship? It's not as if because of Moses, everybody else couldn't enter the land. No, people couldn't enter the land because of their own sin. The federal headship is clear with the Davidic king because it clearly says, Mr. King, if you mess up, the entire nation will suffer. That's the language of federal headship. As the book of Judges stated so prominently, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there was no king in Israel. That was the status of the people beforehand. Everyone just did what was right in their own eyes. Every man for himself. You think it's right, you think it's right, this is what's going on. What they needed was a head, a king, a representative, and that's what the Davidic covenant provides. It established heirs for David as the representatives of the kingdom of Israel. And they're not just role models, guys. I mean, they are supposed to be role models, but they're more than that. Because where the king went, the kingdom went. Righteous kings brought blessing on the land. Wicked kings brought curses on the land. As we read in Kingdom Through Covenant, this is actually a helpful observation. The Mosaic covenant at Sinai is the basis for God's covenant with David. So you see how previously we've said the Abrahamic covenant provides a foundation looking forward to the Mosaic continuity. And now the Mosaic covenant is the basis for God's covenant with David. The king of Israel is the administrator and mediator of the Mosaic covenant, representing God's rule to the people and representing the people as a whole. So, what now, lastly, are the sanctions of the covenant? If the king disobeys, he shouldn't, but if he does, what will happen? Firstly, well, there is the judgment of God himself. God will judge. 2 Samuel 7:14, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, God says, I will discipline him with the rod of men. So the disciplining of kings in David's line was an act of fatherly love from God because of his promise to David. I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. And isn't it interesting that the kings incurred this kind of discipline from the Father, yet ultimately it is by Christ the King's wounds that we are healed, by his stripes that we are forgiven. There was a special father-son relationship going on here. The psalmist writes, the Lord swore to David a sure oath from which he will not turn back. Look at this, one of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant, look at the conditional language, and my testimonies that I shall teach them, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. There is a sense in which the Davidic king needs to procure blessing for the people. If they obey my testimonies, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. But you know, Isaiah says of the coming suffering servant that God shall prolong his days and he shall see his offspring. Sons. Does Jesus have sons? He didn't get married and have children and all of that. Of course, his sons are those who are united to him by faith. The obedience of the Davidic king shall procure blessing for his sons, and we are sons and daughters of King Jesus through faith in him. He, through his obedience as righteous king, has procured our blessing. You see the conditionality. If your sons do this. And if they don't, the consequences of disobedience affects the whole nation. God judges the people, and God will expel the people from the land of Canaan. The blessing and curse motif of the Mosaic covenant is now placed on the shoulders of the king. That's what's going on. Remember the consequences, disinheritance. And when we're talking about the whole nation being disinherited, what are we talking about now? That's called exile. And after the temple's completion, 1 Kings chapter 9, the obey and disobey principle is very clear. If you disobey, you'll be cut off from the land, and you'll become a byword among the nations. What's a byword? Israel would become a byword. A byword is like when the nations look at your nation and they go, at least we're not like Israel. You've become a byword. You've just become some saying like, oh man, I can't believe this is happening in our city. Oh, don't worry, at least we're not like Israel. That's what they had become because of the king's disobedience that ran rampant, and it affected all the people. God once punished Solomon himself for his idolatry. You can see that in 1 Kings chapter 11. You've been committing idolatry, you've been doing all of these things, so what did God do? He said, since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and I will give it to your servant. You see that? The promise continues. Somebody in the line would still receive the kingdom and would have a glorious throne. But he's telling Solomon, I'm going to tear it from you. I'm not going to do it in your days. I'm going to tear it out of the hand of your son. And after generations of kings come, you see exactly what that looks like. So the Davidic covenant is a lot like the Abrahamic in the sense that there are corporate promises which are unconditional. The Davidic line, generally speaking, will be preserved for Messiah's coming. But individual enjoyment of the covenant promises given to David was conditional. The line could be preserved even if some kings were cut off. The promises to David's line, certain, but individual kings could be removed. And the cycle goes on and on and on until Judah finally hits a tipping point because of the wickedness of the kings. And we read, still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath by which his anger was kindled against Judah because of all the provocation with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, look at this, I will remove Judah also out of my sight as I have removed Israel. And I will cast off this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem. Well, I thought this was his chosen city. And now he's going to cast it off. And the house of which I said, my name shall be there. Uh-oh. I thought this was an unconditional promise. Building the house, the city, and so on. But now it's gone. What now? Judah was unrepentant. God has to curse them. And we've gone from Solomon and the glory of God's temple all the way now to Israel's punishment in exile. They were expelled from the land. Sam writes, insofar as the Davidic king keeps the Mosaic covenant, the kingdom enjoys the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. Insofar as the Davidic king fails to keep the Mosaic covenant, the kingdom suffers the curses of the covenants. So that then leaves us with sort of a cliffhanger. Where's the king? Where's the offspring of David? Where is the one he would raise up that would have a righteous scepter that would reign forever? Well, I'll leave you with that cliffhanger. You know what we're anticipating. You know where we're going. Here are some concluding words. The kingdom that the Abrahamic covenant established and governed is the same as that which was further established and governed by the Mosaic and the Davidic covenants. The Old Covenant governs the kingdom of Israel. It includes the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and even the Davidic covenant. Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic gives you an overall understanding of what we call the kingdom of Israel. Remember, God delegates dominion to his chosen people by way of covenants. And Israel is a kingdom that has been given to these people and governed by these three covenants. There's continuity. It's the same parties, similar precepts, an expansion of the promises, an elevation of the penalties, and all of these covenants belong to Abraham's offspring. The Davidic covenant focuses the kingdom into one person, and obedience of that one person is required on behalf of the whole nation. To enjoy blessed life in Canaan, covenant terms must be kept. So think in these terms. The Old Covenant really is the combination of the Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic covenants. Because the Mosaic covenant controls Abraham and David. The Mosaic covenant can rightly be called the focal point of the Old Covenant. That's why often in the New Testament, when we say Old Covenant, it just goes straight to Moses, because that is the focal point of the Old Covenant. The Mosaic covenant controls whether or not you enjoy the Abrahamic promises. And it gives the terms which the Davidic king must keep. So here's the cliffhanger. We're left wondering, where's the righteous king? The one with an everlasting reign. Who is going to represent the people and keep God's law? So next week we will circle back and allow what we've studied to shed light on the Messiah of the Old Covenant. Jesus Christ was very clearly set forth through types and shadows, through prophecies, and so on to the people of God in the days of the Old Testament. There was more than enough contained there and contained in their worship and ordinances and so on that a person who truly belonged to the Lord could see those things and have saving faith in the coming Messiah.